Hi, I'm Natalie. 24 hours after saying I do to the love of my life, I was on my hands and knees, scrubbing my parents' bathroom floor, while my new husband sat alone at our honeymoon cabin, wondering where his wife had disappeared to. When I finally stood up, toilet brush still dripping in my hand, and saw my mother inspecting my work like I was hired help, something inside me snapped. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I looked her dead in the eye and said the words that would change everything. This is the last time you'll ever see me clean anything in this house. She laughed. She actually laughed and told me I was being dramatic, just like always. What she didn't know was that I'd already started planning something that would make her regret ever treating me like her personal servant. They thought they could ruin my honeymoon. They had no idea I was about to change every lock in their lives. The morning light streaming through the cabin windows should have been magical. Marcus and I had saved for 2 years to afford this perfect little retreat in Cannon Beach, complete with ocean views and a fireplace that crackled like something out of a romance novel. Our wedding had been everything we'd dreamed of, held at the Riverside Community Center, with dancing until midnight and cake that actually tasted as good as it looked. We'd driven to the coast that same night, giddy and exhausted, falling into bed as husband and wife for the first time. But instead of waking up wrapped in my new husband's arms, planning lazy walks on the beach and intimate dinners by candlelight, I was staring at my phone screen in horror. 17 missed calls from my mother. 12 text messages that grew increasingly frantic and demanding. The last one, sent at 6 in the morning, made my stomach drop. Emergency at the house, need you here now. Family comes first, remember. Marcus stirred beside me, his dark hair tousled against the white pillowcase. Everything okay, babe? His voice was still thick with sleep, and he reached for me automatically, the way couples do when they've found their person. I should have stayed right there. I should have turned off my phone, kissed my husband good morning, and let whatever crisis my parents had invented work itself out. But 27 years of conditioning don't disappear overnight, even when you've just promised to love someone else more than anyone in the world. It's my mom, I whispered, already sitting up and reaching for the clothes I'd scattered on the floor the night before. She says there's an emergency. Marcus propped himself up on his elbow, concern creasing his forehead. What kind of emergency? Are they hurt? I was already pulling on jeans and a sweater, my movements quick and automatic. This wasn't the first time Linda Parker had declared a family emergency that turned out to be nothing more than her need for attention or free labor. I don't know. She just says I need to come home right away. Natalie? Marcus sat up fully now, the sheet pooling around his waist. His voice carried that gentle firmness I'd fallen in love with, the way he could ground me when my family's chaos threatened to pull me under. We just got married yesterday. We're on our honeymoon. Whatever it is, it can wait a few days. Can't. I paused in the middle of lacing my sneakers, knowing he was right, but unable to shake the anxiety that had been programmed into me since childhood. My parents had a way of making their problems feel like life or death situations, and my mother's disappointed sighs and guilt trips had trained me to drop everything whenever they called. I know, but what if it's really serious this time? What if something's actually wrong? Marcus got out of bed and came over to me, taking my hands in his. Then we'll handle it together. But Nat, look at me. I met his eyes, seeing the concern there, the love and something else that might have been worry. Your parents have a pattern. Remember when your mom called during our engagement party because she desperately needed you to help her reorganize her closet? Or when your dad insisted you had to come over immediately during our anniversary dinner because he couldn't figure out how to work the new television remote? The memories stung because they were true. My parents had been inserting themselves into every major moment of our relationship, always with some urgent need that mysteriously couldn't wait, and somehow always required my specific assistance. But they were still my parents, and the thought of ignoring them when they might genuinely need help made my chest tight with familiar guilt. I'll just go check on them quickly, I said, already knowing I was making a mistake but unable to stop myself. I'll be back in a couple of hours, and then we can have the rest of our honeymoon uninterrupted. Marcus's expression shifted, and I saw something in his eyes I'd never seen before. Not anger exactly, but disappointment. He dropped my hands and stepped back, running his fingers through his hair. Natalie, do you hear yourself right now? You're choosing them over us on our honeymoon. I'm not choosing anyone over anyone, I protested. But even as I said it, I knew it wasn't true. I was choosing my parents' demands over my husband's needs, just like I always have. I'm just being responsible. Family is important. I'm your family now too, Marcus said quietly, and the hurt in his voice cut through me like a blade. We promised yesterday to put each other first, remember, for better or worse, in sickness and in health. We're not even 24 hours into marriage, and you're already breaking that promise. I wanted to argue, to defend myself, to explain that he didn't understand the complexity of my relationship with my parents, but the words died in my throat because somewhere deep down, I knew he was right. I was breaking my promise to him, just like I'd been breaking promises to myself for years. Every time I let my parents manipulate me into being their personal assistant, instead of their adult daughter. I'll make it up to you, I said weakly, grabbing my purse and key. I promise I'll be back soon. Marcus didn't try to stop me, which somehow made it worse. He just stood there in his pajama pants, watching me walk away from our honeymoon, from him, from the life we'd just committed to building together. Drive safe, he said finally, and those two words carried more resignation than I wanted to acknowledge. The drive from Cannon Beach back to Riverside took an hour and a half, and with every mile that passed, my resentment grew. The coastal morning had been perfect, crisp and clear with seagulls calling over the waves. I'd left my husband alone in our honeymoon cabin, to rush back to whatever drama my parents had manufactured this time. By the time I pulled into the driveway of the Victorian house where I'd grown up, I was seething. The house looked exactly the same as always, which should have been my first clue that there was no emergency. The white paint wasn't peeling any more than usual, no windows were broken, no ambulances or fire trucks lined the street. The garden my mother was so proud of looked perfectly maintained, with her prized roses blooming in neat rows along the front walkway. If there had been a real crisis, surely something would have looked different, disturbed, urgent. I rang the doorbell, a habit ingrained from childhood even though I still technically had a key. My mother answered after a long moment, perfectly dressed and made up despite the early hour. Her graying hair was styled in its usual careful waves, her lipstick applied with precision. She didn't look like someone dealing with an emergency, she looked like someone preparing to go to lunch at the country club. "There you are," Linda Parker said, as if I'd been expected for a casual visit rather than summoned for an urgent crisis. "I was starting to wonder if you'd decided to ignore your family completely now that you're married." The comment hit exactly where she'd intended it to, that guilty soft spot she'd been poking at for years. "Mom, what's the emergency? You said you needed me here right away." She stepped aside to let me in, and I noticed she was wearing her good jewelry, the pearl earrings and matching necklace she saved for special occasions. "Well, it's your brother's birthday next weekend, and you know how important family celebrations are to your father and me. We're having the party here, and the house needs to be absolutely perfect." I stopped walking and stared at her. "Kyle's birthday? That's the emergency. Don't use that tone with me, Natalie," she said, her voice taking on the sharp edge I knew meant trouble. "Family should always come first. And Kyle is family. He's bringing that new girlfriend of his, the one from the law firm, and I want everything to be spotless. You know how particular she is." My brother Kyle had been dating Jennifer for 3 months, and she was perfectly nice, but hardly someone who would judge us for having a lived-in home. More importantly, Kyle's birthday was still 6 days away, and my mother was acting like we had hours to prepare for a state dinner. "Mom, I'm on my honeymoon," I said, trying to keep my voice level. "I just got married yesterday. Marcus is waiting for me at the cabin." Linda Parker's expression shifted into the martyred look I knew so well, the one that said I was being selfish and ungrateful after everything she'd done for me. "Oh, I see. Now that you have a husband, your family doesn't matter anymore. I suppose I should have expected this, but I thought I raised you better than that." The guilt hit like a physical blow, exactly as she'd intended. This was her signature move, the emotional manipulation that had controlled me for most of my life. Whenever I tried to set boundaries or prioritize my own needs, she'd twist it into evidence that I didn't care about family, that I was selfish and ungrateful. "It's not that I don't care about family," I said, falling into the trap she'd set. "It's just that this could wait a few days. We planned this honeymoon, we saved up for it. Plans change when family needs you," she said firmly. "That's what being an adult means, Natalie. Sometimes you have to sacrifice your fun for more important things." I found myself nodding, the familiar pattern of submission taking over despite everything in me that wanted to rebel. "What do you need me to do?" The smile that spread across her face was triumphant, though she tried to disguise it as relief. "Well, since you're asking, the whole house needs a deep clean, the bathrooms especially. You know how you've always been so good with the detail work, and the kitchen needs to be scrubbed top to bottom, the floors mopped, the windows washed. Oh, and the guest bedroom needs to be completely reorganized so Jennifer can stay over if she wants to." My heart sank as the scope of her request became clear. This wasn't a quick favor or a small emergency task. She was asking me to spend my entire honeymoon cleaning her house for a party that was still nearly a week away. "Mom, this is going to take all day, maybe longer." "Well, you've always been such a hard worker," she said, already moving toward the kitchen to gather cleaning supplies. "I'm sure you'll figure out how to be efficient. Your father went to the hardware store to pick up some things for the yard work, and I have a hair appointment at 11, so you'll have the house to yourself to really focus." The casual way she mentioned her hair appointment was like a slap. She'd called me away from my honeymoon with claims of an emergency, but she had time for beauty treatments while I scrubbed her house. The unfairness of it made my chest tight with anger and frustration. "What about Kyle?" I asked. "Shouldn't he help clean for his own birthday party?" Linda laughed, a sound that held no real humor. "Kyle's working on that big case, you know how demanding his job is. Besides, he's never been good with housework. You've always been the responsible one, the one I can count on." There it was, the familiar refrain that had shaped my entire life. Kyle got to be the golden child who focused on his career, while I was the responsible one who dropped everything to handle the family's needs, the one who could be counted on to sacrifice her own happiness for everyone else's convenience. I should have said no. I should have turned around, driven back to my husband, and enjoyed the honeymoon we'd worked so hard to afford. But years of conditioning are hard to break, and my mother's disappointment was a weight I'd never learned how to carry. Instead, I found myself tying an apron around my waist and filling a bucket with hot soapy water. The next 6 hours were a blur of scrubbing, mopping, dusting, and organizing. I cleaned baseboards that hadn't been touched in months, reorganized closets that didn't need reorganizing, and polished furniture that was already spotless. My mother returned from her hair appointment looking refreshed and perfectly coiffed, checked my progress with the critical eye of a drill sergeant, and pointed out several areas that needed additional attention. By the time my father came home from his hardware store expedition, I was exhausted, sweaty, and covered in cleaning product residue. Bob Parker surveyed the gleaming house with satisfaction, as if he'd done the work himself. "Looking good, kiddo," he said, patting my shoulder in a way that felt more patronizing than affectionate. "Your mother was right to call you. You've always had such an eye for detail." I wanted to scream that I shouldn't have been there at all, that this was my honeymoon, and I had a husband waiting for me in a cabin by the ocean. Instead, I forced a smile and started gathering up the cleaning supplies, my hands shaking with exhaustion and suppressed rage. "Oh, before you go," my mother said casually, as if she'd just remembered something minor, "could you run to the grocery store and pick up a few things for next week?" I made a list. She handed me a piece of paper covered in her precise handwriting, items ranging from specialty cheeses to expensive wine to decorative flowers for centerpieces. The list was easily $100 worth of groceries, all for a birthday party I wouldn't even be attending since I'd be on my honeymoon. The assumption that I would not only clean her house, but also pay for and shop for Kyle's party supplies, was so outrageous that for a moment, I couldn't speak. "Mom, I'm not even going to be here for the party," I said finally. "I'll still be on my honeymoon." "Well, you could always come back early," she suggested, as if cutting short my honeymoon was a perfectly reasonable option. Family celebrations are so important, and Kyle would be disappointed if his sister wasn't there. That was the moment I felt something shift inside me, a tiny crack in the foundation of guilt and obligation that had controlled me for so long. The audacity of suggesting I should end my honeymoon early to attend a birthday party was so beyond reasonable that even my well-trained sense of family duty couldn't rationalize it. "I'll get the groceries," I said quietly, taking the list, "but I won't be coming back early from my honeymoon." My mother's smile faltered slightly, as if she'd detected something different in my tone but couldn't quite identify what it was. "Well, we'll see," she said dismissively. "You might change your mind once you think about how much it would mean to Kyle." I drove to the grocery store in a daze, pushing a cart through the aisles while mentally calculating how much of our honeymoon fund I was about to spend on someone else's party. The specialty cheese alone cost $40. The wine was $60. By the time I reached the checkout, I'd spent nearly everything we'd budgeted for romantic dinners and activities during our trip. The drive back to Cannon Beach felt endless. The sun was setting by the time I pulled into the cabin's driveway, and I could see Marcus silhouetted in the window, waiting for me. The sight of him standing there, patient and lonely, made my chest ache with guilt and regret. I found him in the kitchen, where he'd prepared a simple dinner for two. Candles were lit on the small dining table, and he'd opened a bottle of wine we'd brought specifically for our first night as a married couple. He looked up when I walked in, and I saw him take in my appearance, the exhaustion written across my face, the way my clothes were wrinkled and stained from a day of cleaning. "How was the emergency?" he asked, and I could hear him trying to keep judgment out of his voice. "It wasn't an emergency," I admitted, sinking into one of the chairs. "My mom wanted me to clean the house for Kyle's birthday party next week." Marcus was quiet for a long moment, processing this information. "You spent our honeymoon day cleaning your parents' house for a party that's 6 days away?" When he said it like that, the absurdity of the situation hit me full force. I'd abandoned my new husband on our honeymoon to scrub toilets and mop floors for a birthday party I wouldn't even attend. I'd spent our date night fund on groceries for someone else's celebration. I'd chosen my mother's convenience over my marriage, just hours after promising to put my husband first. "I'm sorry," I whispered, and the words felt inadequate for the magnitude of what I'd done. "I know I messed up. I know this wasn't what we planned." Marcus reached across the table and took my hand, his thumb tracing circles on my palm. "Nat, I love you, but we need to talk about this pattern. This isn't the first time your parents have pulled you away from important moments in our relationship." He was right, and we both knew it. They'd interrupted our engagement dinner, our anniversary celebration, multiple date nights, and now our honeymoon. Each time I justified it as being a good daughter, honoring my family, doing the right thing. But looking at my husband's face in the flickering candlelight, seeing the hurt and disappointment there, I realized I'd been doing the wrong thing all along. "I don't know how to say no to them," "Every time I try, my mom makes me feel like I'm being selfish, like I don't care about family." "But I'm your family now too," Marcus said gently, "and every time you choose their demands over our relationship, you're telling me that their wants matter more than our needs." The truth of his words hit me like a physical blow. I had been choosing them over him, over us, over the life we were trying to build together. My parents had trained me so well to prioritize their needs that I couldn't even recognize when I was sacrificing my own happiness to enable their selfishness. We spent the rest of the evening talking, really talking, about boundaries and priorities and what it meant to be married. Marcus didn't lecture me or make demands. He just helped me see what I'd been too close to recognize on my own. My parents weren't asking for help when they really needed it. They were asking me to manage their lives, solve their problems, and prioritize their convenience above my own well-being. That night, lying in bed listening to the ocean waves crash against the shore, I made a decision that would change everything. I was done being my parents' unpaid assistant. I was done letting their guilt trips control my choices. I was done sacrificing my marriage to enable their selfishness. I just didn't know yet how much that decision was going to cost me, or how far my parents would go to maintain their control over my life. The next morning would bring phone calls and demands, and escalating manipulation that would test every boundary I tried to set. But for now, wrapped in my husband's arms with the sound of the ocean outside our window, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years, the possibility of putting myself first. What I didn't realize was that my parents had no intention of letting me go without a fight, and the battle for my independence was just beginning. The next morning came too early, pierced by the shrill ring of my phone cutting through the peaceful sound of waves. Marcus groaned beside me, pulling a pillow over his head as I fumbled for the device on the nightstand. The caller ID made my stomach clench. "Mom." It was barely 7 in the morning. "Hello," I answered, my voice thick with sleep. "Natalie, thank goodness you answered." My mother's voice carried that familiar edge of manufactured urgency. "I've been up all night thinking about yesterday, and I realized we forgot something crucial." I sat up in bed, already feeling the familiar anxiety creeping up my spine. "What did we forget?" "The crystal chandelier in the dining room. It's absolutely filthy, and you know how Jennifer notices details like that. It needs to be taken down, cleaned piece by piece, and rehung before the party." I tried to reach Kyle, but he's not answering his phone. Marcus had removed the pillow from his head and was watching me with a mixture of concern and frustration. The morning light streaming through the cabin windows should have been highlighting the start of another perfect honeymoon day, but instead, I was listening to my mother demand that I spend another day servicing her house. "Mom, I'm not coming back today," I said, surprised by the steadiness in my own voice. "I'm on my honeymoon. The chandelier can wait, or you can hire someone to clean it." The silence on the other end stretched long enough that I wondered if the call had dropped. Then came the sigh, heavy with disappointment and martyrdom. "I see. Well, I suppose I shouldn't be surprised. Marriage changes people, doesn't it?" Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Makes them forget where they came from. The guilt hit like a familiar punch to the gut. But this time something was different. Maybe it was Marcus's presence beside me, or the memory of spending my first day as a married woman scrubbing someone else's toilet. But the manipulation felt more obvious now, more transparent. "I haven't forgotten where I came from," I said carefully. "But I'm building something new now, and that has to matter too." "Something new," she repeated the words like they tasted bitter. "I hope this new life of yours is worth abandoning your family over a chandelier." After she hung up, I sat staring at the phone, feeling the familiar cocktail of guilt and resentment churning in my chest. Marcus reached over and gently took the device from my hands, setting it on the far nightstand. "What did she want this time?" he asked. I told him about the chandelier, watching his expression shift from disbelief to something harder to read. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment, looking out at the ocean view we'd paid so much to enjoy. "Nat," he said finally, "do you realize what just happened? She wanted me to clean a chandelier. She wanted you to abandon our honeymoon for the second day in a row to do work that could be done by anyone at any time." His voice was patient, but firm. "This isn't about a chandelier. This is about control." The word hung in the air between us like a revelation. I wasn't quite ready to accept. Control. It sounded so harsh, so intentional. My parents weren't controlling people, were they? They were just particular, demanding, used to having things done a certain way. But as the day progressed, I found myself paying attention in ways I never had before. My phone rang 6 more times. Each call brought a new urgent task that supposedly couldn't wait. The guest bathroom faucet was dripping and needed immediate attention. The flower beds required weeding before the party. The good china needed to be washed and polished. Each request was presented as a crisis that only I could solve, despite the fact that my father was perfectly capable of fixing a faucet and my mother had been tending her own garden for 30 years. Marcus and I had planned to spend the day exploring tide pools and maybe driving up the coast to see some lighthouses. Instead, I found myself pacing the cabin, phone in hand, explaining over and over why I couldn't come running back to Riverside. With each call, my mother's tone grew chillier, her disappointment more pointed. "I just don't understand this selfish streak, Natalie," she said during the 4th call. "It's like you don't care about anyone but yourself anymore." That word, selfish, hit me like a slap. It was the accusation that had controlled me for years, the fear that had kept me in line through countless sacrifices and compromises. But sitting in that beautiful cabin with my patient husband beside me, I started to wonder if wanting to enjoy my honeymoon really was selfish, or if it was just normal. "Marcus," I said after I'd hung up from yet another guilt-laden conversation, "am I being selfish?" He looked up from the book he'd been trying to read, his bookmark marking the same page he'd been on for an hour thanks to the constant interruptions. "Do you think wanting to spend your honeymoon with your husband instead of cleaning your parents' house is selfish?" When he put it like that, the answer seemed obvious, but 27 years of conditioning doesn't disappear overnight. "Maybe I should just go back one more time," I said. "Get everything done so they'll leave us alone for the rest of the trip." Marcus closed his book entirely and turned to face me. "Nat, listen to yourself. You're talking about giving up another day of our honeymoon to enable their behavior. What happens next time? What happens when we want to take a vacation? Or have kids? Or make any major life decision? Are you going to check with your parents first to make sure it doesn't interfere with their needs?" The questions hung heavy in the air, and I realized I didn't have good answers for any of them. My parents had been inserting themselves into every major moment of our relationship, and I'd been letting them, more than letting them. I'd been facilitating it, prioritizing their comfort over my own happiness. That afternoon, while Marcus took a walk on the beach to give me some space to think, I did something I'd never done before. I opened the Notes app on my phone and started writing down every interruption, every demand, every guilt trip from the past 24 hours. The list was longer than I'd expected, and more disturbing when seen all together. Called away from honeymoon for fake emergency that turned out to be party preparation a week early. Spent entire first day of marriage cleaning their house. Expected to pay for party groceries with honeymoon money. Multiple calls demanding return for various non-urgent tasks. Guilt trips and manipulation when boundaries attempted. Seeing it written out like that, in stark black and white, made something click into place. This wasn't normal family behavior. This was a pattern of control disguised as family obligation. I called my best friend Carmen, who was back in Riverside working her usual shift at the veterinary clinic where we'd both started as assistants after college. Carmen had always been the friend who told me hard truths when I needed to hear them, even when those truths were uncomfortable. "Girl, you're calling me from your honeymoon?" she said when she picked up. "This better be good news about ocean views and room service." "Carmen, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me. Always am. What's going on?" I told her about the past 2 days, the cleaning demands, the constant phone calls, the guilt trips. When I finished, Carmen was quiet for so long I thought the call had dropped. "Carmen, are you there?" "I'm here. I'm just trying to figure out how to say this without sounding like a complete bitch." "Just say it." "Natalie, your parents have been pulling this crap for years, and everyone can see it except you. Remember your college graduation, when your mom insisted you leave your own celebration early to help her prepare for Kyle's law school acceptance party? Or when they made you cancel our girls' trip to Vegas because your dad suddenly needed help organizing his workshop?" The memories came flooding back, moments I'd rationalized and justified at the time, but now saw with new clarity. How many times had I chosen my parents' manufactured urgencies over my own plans, my own friends, my own life? "I thought I was being a good daughter," I said quietly. "You were being a trained daughter," Carmen replied, her voice gentle but firm. "There's a difference. Good daughters help when there's a real need. Trained daughters drop everything whenever mommy and daddy snap their fingers." After we hung up, I sat on the cabin's deck watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. Marcus joined me, carrying 2 glasses of wine and a peace-offering smile. "Better?" he asked, settling into the chair beside me. "Different." Carmen helped me see some things I didn't want to admit, such as the fact that this has been going on for years, and I've been so focused on being a good daughter that I forgot to question whether they were being good parents. Marcus reached over and took my hand. "What do you want to do about it?" "I don't know yet, but I know I'm not going back to clean any chandeliers." The next morning, I woke up to 18 missed calls and 37 text messages. The missed calls were from both my parents, Kyle, and even my aunt Patricia, who lived 3 states away and rarely got involved in family drama. The text messages ranged from worried to angry to manipulative, painting a picture of a family in crisis because one member had dared to prioritize her marriage over their convenience. The messages from my mother were particularly revealing when read in sequence. They started with concern, worried about you, haven't heard back, then moved to guilt. Family is supposed to stick together, especially during important times, then escalated to anger. Your selfishness is ruining Kyle's celebration, and finally landed on threats. If you don't call back today, don't bother calling at all. Kyle's messages were shorter but equally manipulative. Mom's really upset, just come home and fix this, as if I was responsible for managing our mother's emotions and fixing a problem I hadn't created. The most surprising messages came from Aunt Patricia, my mother's sister who had always seemed like the reasonable one in the family. Her text revealed a different perspective than I'd expected. Your mother called me crying about you choosing your husband over family. I told her that's exactly what you're supposed to do when you get married. Don't let them guilt you into thinking otherwise. I screenshot that message and sent it to Marcus, who was in the kitchen making coffee. His response was immediate. Smart woman. I like her already. But it was the last message in my mother's series that made my blood run cold. Fine, if you won't come home for Kyle's party, we'll just have to come there. Your father already looked up the address of your cabin. We'll be there this afternoon to talk some sense into you. My hands started shaking as I read the words again. They were going to drive 2.5 hours to our honeymoon cabin, to confront us about not being available to clean their house. The audacity of it was breathtaking, but more than that, it was frightening. They were escalating their control tactics, refusing to accept any boundary I tried to set. Marcus, I called, my voice higher than usual. We have a problem. He appeared in the doorway, coffee mug in hand, and immediately noticed my expression. What's wrong? I showed him the message, watching his face change as he read. When he looked up, his expression was harder than I'd ever seen it. They're coming here, he said, to our honeymoon cabin, to guilt trip you into abandoning our trip to clean their house. Apparently, Marcus set down his coffee mug and ran both hands through his hair, a gesture I recognized as his way of processing anger. This is not normal. This is not what healthy families do. Healthy families don't stalk their adult children on their honeymoon. The word stalk felt harsh, but I couldn't argue with its accuracy. They had looked up our private rental address, and were planning to show up uninvited to force a confrontation. If a friend had told me their parents were doing this, I would have been horrified on their behalf. What do we do? I asked. We leave, Marcus said, without hesitation. We pack up right now and go somewhere else. They want to play games, fine, but they're not going to ruin what's left of our honeymoon. The idea of running away felt both liberating and terrifying. Part of me wanted to stand and fight, to force them to hear why their behavior was unacceptable, but a larger part of me just wanted to protect the fragile peace we'd found, to salvage what we could of this trip we'd worked so hard to afford. We packed quickly, leaving the cabin we'd fallen in love with, but taking our marriage with us. As we loaded our suitcases into the car, I felt something shift inside me, a crystallization of resolve I'd never experienced before. I wasn't just running away from my parents' latest manipulation. I was running toward a life where my marriage came first, where my husband's needs mattered as much as my family's demands, where I got to choose my own priorities. Marcus suggested we drive south toward California, find a different coastal town where we could finish our honeymoon in peace. As we pulled out of the cabin's driveway, I turned off my phone entirely, cutting the cord on their ability to reach me with their manufactured emergencies and emotional manipulation. How does it feel? Marcus asked as we drove past the riverside city limits. Scary, I admit, and kind of amazing. We found a small bed and breakfast in Mendocino, a charming Victorian house, perched on cliffs, overlooking the Pacific. The owner, a woman named Helen who looked like she'd stepped out of a fairy tale, welcomed us warmly and asked no questions about why we were checking in with no reservation in the middle of our stay somewhere else. That evening, as we walked hand in hand through the quaint downtown area, I felt lighter than I had in years. No one knew where we were, no one could call with urgent demands for my attention. For the first time in my adult life, I was completely unavailable to my parents, and the world hadn't ended. I could get used to this, I told Marcus as we shared a dessert at a small cafe, overlooking the harbor. Used to being married to you without having to manage everyone else's emotions at the same time. Marcus smiled, but I could see the concern in his eyes. Nat, you know this is just the beginning, right? When we go home, they're going to escalate. This kind of control doesn't go away just because you ignore it for a few days. He was right, and I knew it. My parents weren't going to suddenly respect boundaries just because I'd refused to clean their chandelier and run from their attempts to hunt me down on my honeymoon. If anything, they were going to be furious about being defied so publicly, so definitively. What do you think they'll do? I asked. I don't know, Marcus said honestly, but I think we need to be prepared for them to get worse before they get better. People who are used to controlling others don't give up that control easily. That night, lying in the comfortable bed at the Victorian Inn, I made a decision that would change the trajectory of my entire relationship with my family. I was going to start documenting every inappropriate demand, every guilt trip, every boundary violation. If my parents wanted to escalate their control tactics, I was going to be ready with evidence of exactly what they were doing. I turned my phone back on long enough to screenshot all the messages from the past few days, then opened a new document on my laptop. At the top, I typed pattern of control and manipulation, Linda and Bob Parker. Below that I started listing incidents, starting with the honeymoon cleaning demand, and working backward through years of similar behavior. The list grew longer than I'd expected, filling page after page with examples of times they'd prioritized their convenience over my well-being, their wants over my needs, their comfort over my happiness. Seeing it all laid out chronologically, I could trace the escalation of their demands over the years, how they'd gradually trained me to drop everything whenever they called. Marcus found me at 3 in the morning, still typing, tears streaming down my face as I documented years of manipulation. I'd been too close to see clearly. Hey, he said softly, sitting on the edge of the bed. What's all this? Evidence, I said, my voice thick with emotion. Carmen was right. This has been going on for years, and I've been enabling it, because I thought that's what family meant. Marcus scrolled through some of the documented incidents, his expression growing darker with each example. Jesus, Nat, look at this pattern. They've been isolating you from friends, interrupting important moments, making you responsible for managing their emotions. This isn't just demanding behavior, this is systematic emotional abuse. The word abuse hit me like a physical blow. I'd never thought of my parents' behavior in those terms, but seeing it laid out in black and white, the pattern was undeniable. They had been systematically undermining my autonomy, training me to prioritize their needs above my own well-being, punishing me with guilt and threats whenever I tried to assert any independence. What do I do with this? I asked. You use it, Marcus said firmly. When we go home and they try to make you feel crazy for setting boundaries, you remember this list. When they try to convince you that their behavior is normal, you look at this evidence. When they try to make you feel guilty for choosing our marriage over their manipulation, you remember that you're not the problem here. The next few days in Mendocino felt like a glimpse into the life we could have if my parents weren't constantly inserting themselves into our relationship. We slept late, took long walks, had leisurely dinners without interruption. Marcus and I talked for hours about our dreams, our plans, our hopes for the future. For the first time since our engagement, we could focus entirely on each other, without the constant background noise of my family's demands. But even in paradise, I couldn't completely escape the anxiety of what was waiting for us back home. My phone, when I occasionally turned it on to check for genuine emergencies, showed a steady stream of increasingly frantic messages from my parents. They'd driven to our original cabin, and found it empty. They'd called the rental company demanding information about where we'd gone. They'd contacted other family members trying to track us down. The most disturbing message came from my father. Your mother is making herself sick with worry. If something happens to her because of your selfishness, it will be on your conscience forever. The emotional manipulation was so blatant, so calculated, that it made me feel sick. They were using my mother's health as a weapon to force my compliance, threatening me with guilt that would last a lifetime if I didn't immediately submit to their demand. But for the first time in my life, I could see the manipulation for what it was. They weren't worried about my safety or well-being. They were angry about losing control, and they were using every tool in their arsenal to get it back. On our last night in Mendocino, as we sat on the inn's wraparound porch watching the sunset, I made a decision that would define the rest of my relationship with my family. "I'm done," I said quietly. "Done with what?" Marcus asked. "Done being their emotional support animal. Done being responsible for managing their feelings. Done sacrificing our happiness to enable their selfishness." I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the decision settle into my bones. "When we go home, things are going to be different." Marcus reached over and took my hand. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking it's time to change some locks." The drive back to Riverside felt like returning to a battlefield. Marcus and I had spent the last hour of our journey in relative silence, both of us processing what we were about to face. My phone had been buzzing constantly since we'd crossed into Oregon, each notification a reminder that my parents weren't going to let this go quietly. As we pulled into the driveway of our little townhouse in the Westfield district, I noticed my mother's silver sedan parked across the street. She was sitting in the driver's seat, arms folded, watching our house, like a detective on a stakeout. The sight made my stomach clench with anxiety and anger in equal measure. "She's been waiting for us," I said to Marcus, nodding toward the car. "How long do you think she's been sitting there?" he asked, his voice tight with controlled frustration. Before I could answer, Linda Parker climbed out of her car and marched across the street toward us. She was dressed in her best guilt trip outfit, the navy blue dress she wore to funerals and other solemn occasions, her face arranged in an expression of wounded dignity. "There you are," she said, her voice carrying that particular blend of relief and accusation she'd perfected over the years. "Do you have any idea how worried we've been? You disappeared without a word. Ignored all our calls. We thought something terrible had happened." I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the documentation I'd compiled over the past few days, like armor around my chest. "Mom, we were on our honeymoon, the honeymoon you interrupted to make me clean your house."
"I did no such thing,"
she snapped, her mask of concern slipping slightly. "I asked for help with an important family event." "There's a difference." Marcus stepped up beside me, his presence both comforting and strengthening.
"Mrs.
"Parker?" With respect. "Calling someone away from their honeymoon to clean a house for a party that's still days away isn't asking for help. It's demanding service." My mother's eyes flashed at Marcus's intervention, and I saw something I'd never noticed before: genuine anger at being challenged. Not hurt, not disappointment, but fury at having her control questioned by someone outside the family system.
"I don't think you understand how families work,
"Young man," she said, her voice icy. "Natalie has always been there for us when we needed her." "That's what family does." "Actually," I said, surprising myself with the steadiness in my voice, "I think Marcus understands families just fine. What I'm starting to understand is that what we've been doing isn't healthy family behavior." The word healthy hung in the air, like a challenge. My mother's face went through several expressions in rapid succession: confusion, indignation, and finally, calculation. "Healthy," she repeated slowly. "I see. Someone's been filling your head with psychology nonsense. Let me guess. This is coming from that friend of yours, Carmen." She never did understand family loyalty. The immediate deflection to blaming outside influences was so predictable it almost made me laugh. Any time I'd ever expressed dissatisfaction with my family's demands, my mother had found someone else to blame for putting ideas in my head, as if I wasn't capable of forming my own opinions about my own experiences. "This is coming from me," I said firmly, "from my own observations about my own life." "Your own observations." My mother's laugh was harsh and dismissive. "Natalie, honey, you've always been dramatic. You read too much into things, make mountains out of molehills. Remember when you thought your father and I didn't love you just because we put Kyle's picture in the front hall instead of yours?" The casual cruelty of the comment hit me like a slap. She was referring to an incident from when I was 12, when I'd noticed that Kyle's school photos always took pride of place in our home, while mine were relegated to less prominent spots. When I'd mentioned feeling left out, my parents had dismissed my hurt as childish jealousy. "I was 12," I said quietly. And I was right to feel hurt. You did treat Kyle's achievements as more important than mine. Oh, for heaven's sake, my mother said, rolling her eyes. You're a grown woman bringing up ancient history. This is exactly what I'm talking about. You blow everything out of proportion. Marcus stepped forward slightly, and I could feel the protective energy radiating from him. Mrs. Parker, dismissing someone's feelings as dramatic or overblown is gaslighting. That's not ancient history, that's a pattern. The word gaslighting seemed to hit my mother like a physical blow. Her face flushed red, and for a moment, I thought she might actually lose her composure entirely. How dare you? She said, her voice shaking with rage. How dare you stand there and psychoanalyze my family with your pop psychology garbage? You've known Natalie for what? 3 years. I've been her mother for 27. And in those 27 years, I said, finding my voice again, you've trained me to drop everything whenever you call, to prioritize your convenience over my own needs, and to feel guilty whenever I try to set boundaries. That's not motherhood, Mom. That's control. The silence that followed was deafening. My mother stared at me as if I'd grown a second head, clearly struggling to process the fact that her traditionally compliant daughter was standing up to her so directly. Control, she repeated finally, her voice dripping with disbelief. I'm controlling because I expect my daughter to care about her family. You're controlling because you expect me to manage your emotions, solve your problems, and sacrifice my own happiness to maintain your comfort. I said, each word feeling like a small act of rebellion. That's not caring about family. That's exploitation. My mother's face went through another rapid series of changes before settling on wounded indignation. I see. Well, I suppose this is what I get for raising an ungrateful daughter. I should have seen this coming when you chose to marry someone who doesn't understand family values. The attack on Marcus was the final straw. I felt something snap inside me, a cord of patience and accommodation that had been stretched thin for years finally breaking under the pressure. Leave, I said, my voice low and dangerous. Get off our property and leave us alone. Excuse me. You heard me. This conversation is over. I'm not going to stand here and let you insult my husband, because I won't let you control my life anymore. My mother's mouth opened and closed several times, like a fish gasping for air. Clearly she'd expected tears, apologies, maybe some groveling and promises to do better. The calm, direct confrontation had thrown her completely off balance. Fine, she said finally, her voice shaking with barely controlled fury. But don't come crying to me when this marriage falls apart, because you chose a man who doesn't understand family loyalty, and don't expect any help from us when you realize what a mistake you've made. She turned and stalked back to her car, climbing in with sharp, angry movements. As she drove away, I noticed she made sure to squeal her tires just enough to let the whole neighborhood know she was upset. Marcus and I stood in our driveway for a long moment, processing what had just happened. I felt simultaneously exhausted and exhilarated, like I'd just run a marathon and won a prize I'd been chasing for years. How do you feel? Marcus asked gently. Like I just broke a spell, I said honestly, and also like I might throw up. He laughed, a sound full of relief and pride. You were amazing. I've never seen you stand up to her like that. I've never felt strong enough to do it before. That evening, as we unpacked our suitcases and tried to settle back into normal life, I found myself jumping at every sound. Part of me expected my parents to show up again, or to call with some new emergency that required my immediate attention. But the hours passed quietly, and slowly I began to believe that maybe, just maybe, I'd actually succeeded in setting a boundary that would stick. I was wrong. The next morning, I woke up to find 17 missed calls from various family members. Not just my parents, but Kyle, Aunt Patricia, my grandmother, and even some cousins I hadn't spoken to in years. Apparently, my mother had spent the evening after our confrontation working the phones, spinning her version of events to anyone who would listen. The voicemails painted a consistent picture. I was being manipulated by my new husband. I'd become selfish and ungrateful, and my poor parents were heartbroken by my sudden change in personality. Several relatives expressed concern that Marcus was isolating me from my family, a classic sign of an abusive relationship. The irony was staggering. My mother was accusing Marcus of the very behavior she'd been exhibiting for years, using the family network as a weapon to pressure me back into compliance. Kyle's message was the most infuriating. Nat, Mom told me about your little tantrum yesterday. I don't know what's gotten into you, but you need to apologize and make this right. You're embarrassing the whole family with this attitude. Little tantrum. As if standing up for myself and my marriage was childish behavior that needed to be corrected. The casual dismissal of my legitimate grievances as a tantrum showed me exactly how little my family thought of my autonomy or right to have boundaries. I called Carmen before I lost my nerve, needing to hear a voice that wasn't connected to my family's drama. "Girl, please tell me you're calling with good news about your honeymoon," she said when she picked up. "Kind of." I finally told my mother exactly what I thought about her behavior. "Shut up." "Really? What did you say?" I gave her the highlights of the confrontation, watching her face light up with pride and satisfaction. "I'm so proud of you," she said when I finished. "It's about damn time. How are you feeling?" "Terrified," I admit. "She's been calling everyone in the family, telling them I'm being manipulated by Marcus and that I've turned against them." "Of course she has. That's what manipulators do when they lose control. They try to rally reinforcements to pressure you back into line." Carmen's matter-of-fact assessment helped me see the situation more clearly. This wasn't about my family being hurt by my behavior. This was about my mother losing control and desperately trying to regain it through whatever means necessary. "What should I do about all the family members calling?" "Nothing," Carmen said firmly. "Don't justify, don't argue, don't defend. Anyone who calls you without getting your side of the story first isn't really concerned about your well-being. They're just doing your mother's bidding." That afternoon, I decided to put Carmen's advice to the test. When my Aunt Patricia called, I answered, curious to see if she would actually listen to my perspective, or if she was just another flying monkey in my mother's campaign. "Natalie, honey," she said, her voice warm but concerned, "I got a very troubling call from your mother last night. She says you've been acting strangely since the wedding, and she's worried about you." "What exactly did she tell you?" I asked, genuinely curious about which version of events my mother was spreading. "She said you abandoned your family obligations to run off on an extended honeymoon, and when she tried to talk to you about it, you became hostile and told her to leave. She's concerned that Marcus might be isolating you from the family." The twisted version of events was so far from reality that I almost laughed. In my mother's telling, she was the concerned parent trying to maintain a relationship, and I was the ungrateful daughter being manipulated by an outsider. "Aunt Patricia, let me tell you what actually happened," I said, and I laid out the real timeline. The fake emergency call on my honeymoon, spending my first day as a married woman cleaning my parents' house, the constant demands and guilt trips, their attempt to track us down at our cabin. The silence on the other end stretched long enough that I wondered if she'd hung up. "Natalie," she said finally, her voice very different now. "Your mother didn't mention any of that. She made it sound like you'd just suddenly become difficult for no reason." "That's because she doesn't see her behavior as problematic. In her mind, I'm supposed to be available whenever she calls, regardless of what's happening in my own life." "Honey, that's not normal. I mean, I know your mother can be demanding, but calling you away from your honeymoon to clean house, that's not acceptable." The validation from someone in my family felt like a lifeline. Patricia was my mother's own sister, and if she could see that the behavior was inappropriate, maybe I wasn't crazy after all. "I'm glad someone else thinks so," I said, "but apparently, most of the family thinks I'm being manipulated by Marcus." "Most of the family is only hearing your mother's version of events," Patricia said dryly, "and your mother has always been very good at presenting herself as the victim in any situation." That comment hung in the air like a revelation. Patricia had known my mother longer than anyone, had grown up with her, seen her patterns over decades. If she was acknowledging that my mother played the victim role, it meant this behavior wasn't new or isolated. "Has she always been like this?" I asked. "Oh, honey, your mother has been manipulating people with guilt and manufactured crises since we were teenagers. I just always hoped she'd grow out of it," especially after she had children. The conversation with Patricia was a turning point. For the first time, I had validation from someone within my family system that my mother's behavior was problematic and had been for years. It wasn't Marcus's influence, or my imagination, or postpartum dramatic tendency. It was a recognized pattern that had been going on long before I was even born. That evening, I shared the conversation with Marcus, who listened with a mixture of relief and concern. "I'm glad someone in your family can see what's happening," he said, "but I'm worried about what your parents are going to do next. People like this don't usually give up easily when their first attempt at regaining control fails." His concern proved to be prophetic. The next morning, I got a call at work from Gloria Chen, our elderly neighbor who lived directly across from my parents' house. "Natalie, dear," she said, her voice uncertain, "I hope I'm not overstepping, but I thought you should know that your parents have been asking some very strange questions about you and Marcus." My stomach dropped. "What kind of question?" "Well, yesterday your mother came over with a casserole, which was nice, but then she started asking if I'd noticed any changes in your behavior lately. She wanted to know if Marcus ever seemed controlling when you visited, if I'd seen any signs that you might be in an abusive relationship." The audacity took my breath away. My mother was actually going door to door in her neighborhood, trying to build a case that Marcus was abusive, presumably so she could justify her attempts to rescue me from his influence. "Miss Chen, I want you to know that Marcus has never been anything but loving and supportive. My mother is upset because I've started setting boundaries about her demands, and she's trying to blame him for my independence." "Oh dear," Gloria said, her voice heavy with understanding. "I was afraid of something like that. Your mother has always been rather intense about having things her way." After I hung up, I sat in my car in the hospital parking lot, shaking with rage and disbelief. My mother wasn't just spreading lies within the family anymore. She was actively trying to destroy my husband's reputation in their community, painting him as an abuser to justify her own controlling behavior. I called Marcus immediately, my voice tight with fury as I explained what Gloria had told me. "She's trying to get the neighbors to believe you're abusing me," I said. "She's going door to door building a false narrative so she can play the concerned mother trying to save her daughter." The silence on Marcus's end was long and ominous. When he finally spoke, his voice was carefully controlled in a way that told me he was angrier than I'd ever heard him. "Natalie, this has crossed a line. She's not just manipulating you anymore. She's actively trying to damage my reputation and our marriage. This is defamation and it needs to stop." That afternoon, Marcus left work early and met me at home. Together we sat at our kitchen table and made a list of everything my parents had done since our wedding: the fake emergency, the stalking behavior at our cabin, the family phone campaign, and now the neighborhood defamation campaign. "This is escalating rapidly," Marcus said, reviewing our notes. "Your mother isn't just trying to maintain control over you anymore. She's actively trying to destroy our marriage to get you back under her influence." Looking at the timeline laid out in front of me, I could see the escalation clearly. Each time I'd set a boundary or resisted their control, they'd responded with increasingly aggressive tactics. The pattern was unmistakable and deeply disturbing. "What do we do?" I asked. "We document everything, and we prepare for this to get worse before it gets better," Marcus said grimly. "People who are this invested in controlling others don't usually back down when confronted. They double down." That evening I started a detailed journal, recording every incident with dates, times, and witnesses, where possible. I also began taking screenshots of every manipulative text message and voicemail, building a comprehensive record of their behavior. As I worked, I thought about Mrs. Chen's comment that my mother had always been intense about having things her way. I realized that what I'd experienced as normal family dynamics had actually been a carefully constructed system of control that had been normalized over years of repetition. The next few days brought a temporary quiet that felt more ominous than reassuring. No phone calls, no unexpected visits, no emergency demands, but instead of feeling relieved, I found myself waiting for the other shoe to drop. It dropped on Friday afternoon. I was finishing up my shift at Pine Valley Medical Center when one of the other nurses approached me with a concerned expression. "Natalie," she said quietly, There are some people here asking to speak with you. They say they're from Adult Protective Services. My blood turned to ice. Adult Protective Services was called when there were concerns about vulnerable adults being abused or neglected. The only reason they would want to speak with me was if someone had reported that I was being abused or was in danger. I walked to the lobby with shaking legs, knowing exactly who had made the call but still hoping I was wrong. Two professional-looking women in their 40s were waiting near the reception desk, both carrying official badges and serious expressions. "Miss Thompson," one of them said, using my new married name. "I'm Sarah Williams from Adult Protective Services. We received a concerning report about your welfare, and we'd like to speak with you privately if possible." I led them to a small conference room used for family meetings, my mind racing with fury and disbelief. My mother had actually called Adult Protective Services on my husband, trying to use the system designed to protect vulnerable people as a weapon in her campaign to regain control over my life. "What exactly were you told?" I asked once we were seated. Sarah consulted her note. "We received a report from someone claiming to be your mother, stating that you've undergone a dramatic personality change since your recent marriage, that you've become isolated from your family, and that she has concerns about your husband's controlling behavior." The clinical language made my mother's lies sound almost reasonable, but I could hear the manipulation underneath every carefully chosen word. "I see," I said, working to keep my voice steady. "And what would you like to know from?" The two women spent the next hour asking detailed questions about my relationship with Marcus, my family dynamics, and any changes in my life since getting married. I answered honestly, explaining the boundary-setting process I'd begun, and the escalating response from my parents. As I spoke, I watched their expressions shift from professional concern to understanding to something that looked like sympathy. "Ms. Thompson," Sarah said when I finished, "based on what you've told us and what we observe, we don't see any indicators of abuse or coercion in your marriage. What we do see are signs that you're making healthy changes in response to controlling family dynamics." The validation was both relieving and infuriating. Relief that they could see the truth of my situation. Fury that my mother had wasted these professionals' time and resources with her false allegations. "However," Sarah continued, "we do need to let you know that the person who made this report specifically requested that we do a home visit to assess your living situation. Are you comfortable with that?" I thought about my mother sitting at home, probably waiting by the phone for news that her latest scheme had worked, that APS had confirmed her narrative and would help her rescue me from my terrible husband. "Actually," I said, "I'd welcome a home visit. I think it would be good to have official documentation that there's nothing concerning about my marriage or living situation." The next afternoon, Sarah and her colleague came to our townhouse in Westfield. Marcus had taken time off work to be present, and together we gave them a tour of our home, showed them our financial records, and answered more questions about our relationship. The house was clean and well maintained, our finances were stable and jointly managed, and our interactions showed clear signs of mutual respect and affection. After an hour of observation and questions, the APS workers seemed satisfied. "We'll be closing this case as unfounded," Sarah told us before leaving, "but I do want to give you some advice. False reports to APS are serious, and if this pattern continues, you may want to consider consulting with an attorney about harassment." That evening, as Marcus and I sat on our couch processing the surreal experience of being investigated by social services because of my mother's lies, I felt something harden inside me that hadn't been there before. "She's gone too far," I said quietly. "What are you thinking?" Marcus asked. "I'm thinking it's time to change those locks." The idea had been percolating in the back of my mind for days, but now it crystallized into a firm decision. My parents still had keys to our house, a leftover from when they'd helped us move in, and we'd given them spare keys for emergency. At the time, it had seemed like a normal family thing to do. Now it felt like giving loaded weapons to people who'd proven they couldn't be trusted. "You want to change the locks on our house?" Marcus asked. "I want to change the locks on everything," I said, the plan forming as I spoke. "The house, yes, but also all our passwords, our emergency contacts, our access to shared information, I want to create a fortress they can't penetrate when they decide to escalate again. When they escalate again, Marcus repeated. Not if. Definitely when. This APS call was just their latest attempt. When it doesn't work, they'll try something else. But I'm done being reactive. It's time to get ahead of their games. That weekend, we changed the locks on both the front and back doors of our house. We updated all our passwords and security questions, removed my parents from our emergency contact lists, and set up new privacy settings on all our social media accounts. Each small action felt like a declaration of independence, a tangible step toward reclaiming control over our own lives. But even as we worked to protect ourselves, I knew this was just the beginning. My mother had proven she was willing to involve neighbors, family members, and government agencies in her campaign to regain control over me. The question wasn't whether she would escalate further. The question was how far she was willing to go, and whether I was strong enough to withstand whatever came next. The new locks were barely a week old when my mother made her next move. I discovered it on a Tuesday morning when I arrived at Pine Valley Medical Center to find my supervisor, Helen Winters, waiting for me with an expression I'd never seen before, part concern, part confusion, and part something that looked like anger. Natalie, we need to talk, she said, her voice carefully controlled. My office, please. The walk down the hallway felt endless. Dr. Winters had been my supervisor for 3 years, and we'd developed a good working relationship, built on mutual respect and professionalism. She'd never summoned me to her office with such gravity before. Sit down, she said, once we were behind closed. She settled behind her desk and folded her hands, studying me with the kind of clinical assessment I'd seen her use with difficult diagnoses. Yesterday afternoon, I received a very disturbing phone call, she began. Someone claiming to be your mother called to express concerns about your mental health and stability. She suggested that recent life changes might be affecting your ability to perform your duties safely. The words hit me like a physical blow. My mother had called my workplace, attempting to sabotage my career by planting seeds of doubt about my mental competency. The violation felt so massive that for a moment I couldn't breathe. What exactly did she say? I managed to ask. Dr. Winters consulted a notepad on her desk. She claimed that you've been acting erratically since your marriage, that you've become hostile toward family members, and that she's concerned about your judgment. She suggested that we might want to monitor your patient interactions more closely. The calculated cruelty of it was breathtaking. My mother knew how much my career meant to me, how hard I'd worked to build a reputation as a competent, caring nurse. By attacking my professional standing, she was striking at the very core of my identity outside the family system. Dr. Winters, I said, working to keep my voice steady, I need to tell you what's actually been happening. I laid out the entire timeline, starting with the honeymoon incident and moving through each escalation: the stalking behavior, the family campaign, the neighborhood defamation, and the false APS report. Winters listened without interruption, her expression growing darker with each revelation. So your mother called my workplace to try to damage your career because you set boundaries about cleaning her house during your honeymoon, she said when I finished, her tone flat with disbelief. That's the core of it. Yes. Dr. Winters leaned back in her chair, processing the information. Natalie, in my 15 years in healthcare administration, I've seen family conflicts affect workplace performance, but I've never had a parent call to sabotage their own child's career out of spite. What happens now? I asked, dreading the answer. Nothing happens, Dr. Winters said firmly. Your work performance has been exemplary, your patient evaluations are consistently excellent, and your colleagues respect you. One vindictive phone call from a family member doesn't change 3 years of professional excellence. The relief was overwhelming, but it was quickly replaced by a cold realization. If my mother was willing to attack my career, there was no limit to how far she might go. However, Dr. Winters continued, I'm concerned about what else she might try. Have you considered documenting these incidents formally? If this escalates further, you may need legal protection. The suggestion of legal action felt both foreign and necessary. I'd been approaching this as a family problem that could be solved with better communication and clearer boundaries. But my mother's willingness to involve my employer crossed a line into something that might require professional intervention. I've been keeping records, I said, but I hadn't thought about involving lawyers. Think about it, Dr. Winters advised. What your mother is doing, the false reports, the workplace sabotage, the defamation, these aren't just family boundary issues, they're harassment, and in some cases, they might be illegal. That afternoon, I left work early and drove to Thompson & Associates, a law firm that Carmen had recommended when I'd mentioned my situation to her. The office was modern and reassuring, with soft lighting and comfortable furniture that made difficult conversations feel less intimidating. The attorney who met with me was a woman named Jennifer Blake, probably in her late 30s, with kind eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor that immediately put me at ease. "Tell me what's been happening," she said, settling into her chair with a legal pad and pen. I went through the timeline again, this time with all the documentation I'd been keeping. Jennifer took notes throughout, asking clarifying questions and requesting specific dates and details. "Mrs. Thompson," she said when I finished, "what you're describing is a clear pattern of harassment. The false reports to APS, the workplace sabotage, the defamation in your neighborhood, these are serious issues that go well beyond normal family conflict. What can I do about it?" "Several things. First, we can send a cease and desist letter, formally demanding that your parents stop all contact and harassment. Second, we can prepare documentation for a restraining order if the behavior continues. Third, if they persist, we can explore civil remedies for defamation and intentional infliction of emotional distress." The legal terminology made everything feel more real and more serious. This wasn't just about family drama anymore. It was about protecting myself and my marriage from people who had proven they would use any means necessary to maintain control. "What would a cease and desist letter accomplish?" I asked. "It creates an official record that they've been put on notice about their behavior. If they continue to harass you after receiving formal legal warning, it strengthens any future legal action we might need to take." I authorized Jennifer to draft the letter that afternoon. As I drove home, I felt a mixture of empowerment and sadness. Taking legal action against my parents felt like crossing a bridge I could never uncross, but they'd made it clear that boundaries meant nothing to them unless enforced by outside authority. Marcus was waiting for me when I got home, and I could see in his face that something else had happened. "What now?" I asked, exhaustion creeping into my voice. "Your brother called my office today," he said grimly. "He told my boss that he was concerned about my mental health and wondered if the stress might be affecting my work performance." The systematic nature of their campaign was becoming clear. They weren't just targeting me anymore, they were going after Marcus's career, trying to damage both of our professional reputations as punishment for my defiance. "What did your boss say?" He was confused and concerned. "Kyle presented himself as a worried family member, said you'd been acting strangely since our marriage, and he thought I might be under stress trying to deal with your problems." The twisted narrative was consistent. I was the unstable one, and Marcus was either my victim or my enabler. By positioning themselves as concerned family members, my parents and Kyle were able to present their harassment as care and concern. "Did you tell your boss what's really happening?" I gave him the broad strokes. "Fortunately, I've worked there for 5 years and have a good reputation. But Nat, this is escalating rapidly. They're not just trying to control you anymore. They're actively trying to destroy our lives." That evening, we sat at our kitchen table with all our documentation spread out like evidence in a criminal investigation. The pattern was undeniable and deeply disturbing. False emergencies, manipulation, stalking, defamation, false reports to authorities, and now workplace sabotage targeting both of us. "They're trying to isolate us," Marcus said, studying the timeline. "If they can damage our careers and reputations, they think we'll have no choice but to come back to them for support." The insight was chilling because it made perfect sense. My parents weren't just punishing me for setting boundaries, they were systematically attacking every source of independence and support in my life, trying to create a situation where submission to their control would be my only option. "It's not going to work," I said, surprised by the steel in my own voice. "I'd rather lose everything than go back to being their emotional servant." The next morning brought the response I'd been dreading and expecting in equal measure. Jennifer Blake called to tell me that the cease and desist letter had been delivered, and my parents' attorney had already responded. "They're denying all allegations and claiming that their actions have been motivated by genuine concern for your welfare," Jennifer said. "Their lawyer says they're prepared to provide evidence that you've been exhibiting concerning behavior since your marriage." "What kind of evidence?" "They're claiming to have witness statements from family members and neighbors documenting your alleged personality changes and erratic behavior. They're also suggesting that your husband may be influencing you inappropriately." The audacity was staggering, but I was beginning to understand how my parents operated. They didn't just react to challenges to their control. They methodically built counter-narratives that positioned them as the reasonable parties concerned about a troubled family member. "What does this mean for us?" "It means they're not backing down. In fact, they're doubling down. I think we need to prepare for them to escalate further." Jennifer's prediction proved accurate sooner than either of us expected. That afternoon, I received a call from Carmen that made my blood run cold. "Nat, you need to know something," she said without preamble. "Your mother came to the veterinary clinic today. She came to your work. She claimed she was concerned about you and wanted to talk to someone who knew you well. She started asking all these questions about your behavior, whether I'd noticed changes in your personality, whether Marcus seemed controlling." The systematic nature of my mother's campaign was becoming clear. She wasn't just making random accusations, she was methodically visiting people in my life, trying to build a case that I was mentally unstable or being abused. "What did you tell her?" "I told her that you seemed happier and more confident than I'd seen you in years, and that Marcus was obviously good for you." She did not like that answer. "How did she react?" "She got angry and started lecturing me about how family loyalty was more important than supporting someone's destructive choices. Then she warned me that I might be enabling your deterioration by encouraging your independence." The conversation with Carmen revealed the depth of my mother's delusion. In her mind, anyone who supported my autonomy was contributing to my destruction, while only those who supported her control truly cared about my well-being. That evening, Marcus and I made a decision that felt both necessary and heartbreaking. We started calling everyone in our support network, friends, colleagues, other family members, to give them our version of events, before my parents could reach them with their manufactured concern. The conversations were exhausting and humiliating. Having to explain to friends and colleagues that my parents were conducting a defamation campaign against me and my husband felt surreal and degrading, but it was also revealing in ways I hadn't expected. Most people were supportive and understanding once they heard the real story. Several shared their own experiences with controlling family members, and many expressed shock at the extremes my parents were willing to pursue, but some responses were disappointing. A few family members seemed uncomfortable with the conflict and suggested that surely there must be some way to work things out through better communication. Others implied that I was being too harsh, that family relationships required more forgiveness and accommodation than other relationships. The varied responses helped me understand how my parents had been able to maintain their control for so long. Their behavior was just subtle enough, just wrapped in enough concern and family rhetoric, that people who hadn't experienced it directly could rationalize it as misguided love, rather than systematic manipulation. By the end of the week, I felt like I was living in a war zone. Every phone call might bring news of another attack on our reputations, another institution or person my parents had contacted with their concerns about my welfare. The stress was affecting my sleep, my appetite, and my ability to concentrate at work. But it was also clarifying something important: the extent to which my parents were willing to go to maintain control over my life. This wasn't about love or concern or family loyalty. This was about power, and they were willing to destroy my career, my marriage, and my mental health, rather than accept that I had the right to make my own choices. Saturday morning brought what felt like the final escalation. I was having coffee on our back patio when I noticed a car parked across the street from our house. Not my mother's silver sedan, but a dark blue SUV with two people inside who seemed to be watching our house. "Marcus," I called, trying to keep my voice calm, "can you come out here for a minute?" He joined me on the patio and followed my gaze to the SUV. As we watched, one of the occupants lifted what looked like a camera with a long lens. "Are they taking pictures of our house?" Marcus asked, his voice tight with controlled anger. Before I could answer, my phone rang. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, but when I answered, I heard my father's voice. "Natalie, we need to talk," he said without preamble. "Your mother and I are very concerned about some of the choices you're making, and we think it's time for an intervention." The word intervention sent a chill down my spine. In the context of everything else that had been happening, it sounded less like a concerned family meeting and more like a threat. "What kind of intervention, Dad?" "The kind where people who love you help you see that you're making mistakes that could ruin your life. We've been talking to other family members, and everyone agrees that you need help." As he spoke, I watched the SUV across the street. The people inside were definitely documenting our house, probably trying to gather evidence to support whatever narrative my parents were building. "Dad, if you want to talk, you can make an appointment through my attorney, but this surveillance needs to stop immediately." "Surveillance?" His voice carried that familiar tone of wounded innocence. "We're not surveilling anyone, we're trying to help a daughter who's clearly in trouble." "Then tell your private investigators to leave," I said, surprising myself with my directness. There was a long pause. "I don't know what you're talking about. The people in the blue SUV across from our house taking pictures. If they're not yours, I'll call the police and report them for stalking." Another pause, longer this time. "Natalie, you're being paranoid. This is exactly the kind of erratic thinking we're concerned about." The gaslighting was so blatant, so obviously calculated, that it made me angry rather than confused. They were literally having me surveilled while denying it was happening, then using my awareness of their surveillance as evidence of my mental instability. "Goodbye, Dad," I said, and hung up. Marcus was already on his phone with the police, reporting suspicious activity in our neighborhood. Within 20 minutes, a patrol car arrived and approached the SUV. We watched from our living room window as the officers spoke with the occupants, checked their identification, and took notes. After about 15 minutes, the SUV drove away, and one of the officers came to our door. "Those were private investigators," Officer Kim told us. "They claimed to be conducting a welfare check on behalf of concerned family members, but they don't have any legal authority to surveil your property. I've advised them that their presence is unwelcome, and that continued surveillance could constitute stalking." "Can we do anything to prevent them from coming back?" Marcus asked. "Document everything. If they return, call us immediately. And you might want to consider consulting with an attorney about a restraining order. This level of surveillance suggests an escalating situation." After the officer left, Marcus and I sat in our living room processing what had just happened. My parents had hired private investigators to watch our house, document our activities, and presumably gather evidence to support their narrative that I was mentally unstable or being controlled by my husband. "This is insane," Marcus said, running his hands through his hair. "They've hired actual private investigators because you won't clean their house on demand." The absurdity of the situation would have been funny if it wasn't so threatening, but looking at the bigger picture, I could see the method in their madness. They were systematically building a case that I was incompetent to make my own decisions, that my marriage was harmful to my well-being, and that they needed to step in to protect me from myself. It was a sophisticated form of emotional abuse, designed to undermine my autonomy and force me back under their control. And if I had any doubt about their ultimate intentions, the private investigators made it clear, they weren't just trying to punish me for setting boundaries. They were trying to gather evidence for some kind of legal action. That evening I called Jennifer Blake at home, something I'd never done before, but which felt necessary given the escalation. "They've hired private investigators," I told her without preamble. "What kind of private investigators?" I described the surveillance, the welfare check claim, and my father's denial of any knowledge, despite obvious coordination. Mrs. Thompson, this is a significant escalation. Combined with everything else they've done, this suggests they may be building towards some kind of legal action. We need to meet first thing Monday morning to discuss protective measures. What kind of legal action? Possibly a conservatorship petition. If they can convince a court that you're mentally incompetent to manage your own affairs, they could potentially gain legal control over your finances, medical decisions, and living situation. The words hit me like a physical blow. A conservatorship would essentially strip me of all adult autonomy, turning me into a legal child under my parents' control. It would mean they could force me to leave Marcus, control where I lived, manage my money, and make decisions about my medical care. Can they actually do that? It's difficult, but not impossible. They would need to prove to a court that you're unable to care for yourself or make rational decisions. The private investigators, the documentation of your supposed erratic behavior, the witness statements from family members, it's all building toward that kind of case. But I'm not mentally incompetent. I'm a registered nurse with a stable career and marriage. I know that, and any objective evaluation would show that. But conservatorship cases can be influenced by family dynamics and emotional manipulation. If they can present a compelling narrative about sudden personality changes and concerning behavior, some courts might be willing to err on the side of caution. The conversation left me shaken in a way I hadn't experienced before. All the harassment, manipulation, and sabotage had been building toward this illegal attempt to strip me of my adult autonomy and place me under my parents' complete control. As I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling while Marcus slept beside me, I realized that everything I'd been through had been preparation for this moment. My parents hadn't been randomly escalating their control tactic. They'd been systematically building a case to prove I was incompetent to live my own life. The documentation I'd been keeping, the legal advice I'd been getting, the boundaries I'd been setting, it had all been leading to this confrontation. My parents had made it clear that they would rather destroy my life than accept my independence. But lying there in the darkness, I felt something I hadn't expected. Not fear, but determination. They wanted a fight, they were going to get one. But this time, I wasn't going to be the helpless daughter they expected. I was going to be ready. Monday morning couldn't come fast enough. It was time to stop playing defense and start taking control of this situation before my parents could strip me of the right to control anything at all. Monday morning arrived gray and drizzling, matching my mood as Marcus and I sat in Jennifer Blake's office at 8 sharp. The weekend had been tense, both of us jumping at every car that drove past our house, wondering if the private investigators would return. Jennifer spread our documentation across her conference table like a battle plan: phone records, screenshots, witness statements, the APS report, employment records showing the sabotage attempts, and photos of the surveillance vehicle created an overwhelming visual of my parents' campaign. After reviewing everything over the weekend, I'm convinced they're building toward a conservatorship petition, Jennifer said without preamble. The pattern is too systematic to be anything else. They're trying to create a legal narrative that you're mentally incompetent. What's our best defense? Marcus asked. We go on offense, Jennifer replied. We file for restraining orders against both parents and your brother. We document every violation, and we get ahead of any conservatorship attempt by having you evaluated by independent mental health professionals who can attest to your competency. The idea of being psychiatrically evaluated felt invasive and humiliating, but I understood the necessity. If my parents tried to have me declared incompetent, I needed professional documentation that I was mentally sound and capable of making my own decisions. There's something else, Jennifer continued. Given the escalation pattern, I think we should consider going public with this story. Not social media drama, but a formal press release about harassment and abuse of legal systems. Sometimes public scrutiny can deter this kind of behavior. The suggestion made my stomach clench. Going public would mean admitting to the world that my family was dysfunctional enough to require legal intervention, but it would also mean other people in similar situations might recognize the patterns and seek help. I need to think about that, I said. Take your time, but don't take too long. The private investigators suggest they're moving quickly toward whatever their endgame is. That afternoon, I met with Dr. Amanda Reese, a forensic psychologist Jennifer had recommended, who specialized in family court cases. Dr. Reese was a woman in her 50s with graying hair and gentle eyes that somehow made me feel safer than I had in weeks. "Tell me about your relationship with your parents," she said after the initial paperwork was complete. I told her everything, starting with childhood memories I'd never really examined before, the constant criticism disguised as concern, the way my achievements were minimized while Kyle's were celebrated, the gradual training to prioritize their emotional needs over my own well-being. "When you were growing up, how did your parents respond when you tried to assert independence?" Dr. Reese asked. "They made me feel selfish and ungrateful. If I complained about anything, I was being dramatic. If I wanted to spend time with friends instead of family, I was abandoning them." "And how did that make you feel?" "Like there was something wrong with me for wanting normal teenage things. Like I was bad for not being grateful enough for everything they did for me." Dr. Reese took extensive notes throughout our 2-hour session, asking detailed questions about my current mental state, my marriage, my career, and my decision-making processes. "Mrs. Thompson," she said at the end of our appointment, "you demonstrate clear insight into your family dynamics, appropriate emotional responses to stress, and sound judgment in your personal and professional decisions. There is absolutely nothing in our conversation that suggests any form of mental incompetency. Will you put that in writing? I'll prepare a comprehensive evaluation report. If your parents attempt any legal action questioning your competency, this documentation will be crucial." That evening, Marcus and I made a decision that felt both terrifying and liberating. We were going to accept Jennifer's suggestion about going public, but we were going to do it our way. "I want to write an op-ed for the Riverside Tribune," I told him. "Something that explains what emotional abuse and manipulation look like in families, using our story as an example. Are you sure you're ready for that kind of exposure?" "I'm ready for this to stop. And if sharing our story helps one other person recognize these patterns in their own family, it'll be worth it." I spent the next 2 days crafting an article titled, "When Family Love Becomes Family Control." I wrote about the difference between normal family closeness and systematic manipulation. I described the escalation tactics manipulative parents use when their adult children try to assert independence. I outlined the warning signs that family concern is actually emotional abuse. The hardest part was making it clear that this wasn't about normal family conflict or generational differences. This was about adults who refused to accept that their children had the right to make their own choices, even when those choices were healthy and appropriate. Jennifer reviewed the article before I submitted it, making sure nothing could be used against us legally. The Tribune's editor, a woman named Patricia Ross, called me personally after reading it. "This is powerful," she said. "Are you prepared for the response this might generate?" "What kind of response?" "Well-written pieces about family abuse tend to hit a nerve. You'll probably get a lot of support from people who've experienced similar situations, but you might also get pushback from people who think family loyalty should trump everything else. I'm prepared for that." The article ran on Wednesday morning with the byline, "By Natalie Parker Thompson, Riverside resident." I used my maiden name along with my married name to make it clear that I wasn't hiding from my family's response. The reaction was immediate and overwhelming. By noon, the Tribune's website had received over 200 comments on the article. My phone started ringing with calls from local news stations wanting to do follow-up interviews, but the most meaningful responses came through email and social media. Dozens of people shared their own stories of family manipulation and control. Adult children who'd been guilt-tripped into giving up careers to care for parents who weren't actually incapacitated. Married couples whose families had tried to sabotage their relationship. Young adults who'd been financially controlled and emotionally manipulated into remaining dependent, long past the age when they should have been independent. Reading those messages, I realized how common this pattern was, and how rarely it was discussed openly. Most people suffering from family manipulation stayed silent, believing their situations were unique, or that family loyalty required them to endure abuse. Thursday morning brought the response I'd been dreading and expecting. My phone rang at 7 a.m. with a call from an unknown number. "You've made a terrible mistake," my mother's voice said, without any greeting. That disgusting article is going to destroy this family's reputation. No, Mom, I said, surprised by the calmness in my voice. Your behavior is what's destroying this family. The article just made it public. You're going to regret this, Natalie. We tried to handle this privately, but you forced our hand. You'll be hearing from our attorney very soon. She hung up before I could respond, but I wasn't surprised. The article had backed them into a corner where they either had to acknowledge their behavior was inappropriate or escalate to more extreme measures. Friday afternoon, Jennifer called with news I'd been anticipating. They filed for emergency conservatorship this morning, she said. They're claiming you're mentally unstable and being manipulated by your husband into making decisions that endanger your well-being. What happens now? We fight it. The good news is that Dr. Reese's evaluation report is comprehensive and damning to their case. The bad news is that we have to go through a court process that will be emotionally exhausting. When's the hearing? Next Wednesday. That's unusually fast, which suggests they convinced the judge there's some kind of emergency situation requiring immediate intervention. The next few days were a blur of preparation. Jennifer and I gathered character references from my colleagues, my supervisor, friends, and even some family members like Aunt Patricia, who were willing to testify that I was competent and stable. Dr. Reese prepared additional documentation, including a detailed analysis of the harassment campaign my parents had conducted. She characterized their behavior as systematic emotional abuse designed to undermine the subject's competence and autonomy. Marcus took the week off work to support me through the process. Having him beside me reminded me daily that I had something worth fighting for, a healthy relationship built on mutual respect and genuine love, not control and manipulation. The night before the hearing, I couldn't sleep. I sat at our kitchen table reading through all the documentation one more time, still amazed by the scope of my parents' campaign. You know what's crazy? I said to Marcus, who was making us late-night tea. If they'd just accepted that I was married and let me live my life, none of this would have happened. They turned one boundary about cleaning their house into a legal battle that's going to destroy our relationship forever. That's the thing about people like your parents, Marcus said gently. They can't accept that other people have the right to say no to them. It's not really about the house cleaning. It's about the fact that you chose your own priorities over theirs. Wednesday morning dawned clear and cold. I dressed in my most professional outfit, a navy blue suit that made me look competent and stable, and met Jennifer at the courthouse. My parents were there with their attorney, a stern-looking man in his 60s, who projected an air of moral authority. Kyle sat beside them, dressed in his best suit, and looking like the successful son who was concerned about his troubled sister. The hearing room was smaller than I'd expected, with fluorescent lighting that made everyone look pale and tired. Judge Morrison was a woman in her 50s, who looked like she'd seen every kind of family dysfunction imaginable. My parents' attorney spoke first, painting a picture of a loving family concerned about a daughter who'd undergone a dramatic personality change after marriage. He described my abandonment of family obligations, my hostile response to their concerns, and my irrational decision to go public with private family matters. Your Honor, he said, this young woman was once a caring, responsible daughter who put family first. Since her marriage, she's become defiant, paranoid, and unable to maintain normal family relationships. Her recent public attack on her parents demonstrates poor judgment and possible mental instability. It was skillfully done, presenting their control as love and my independence as evidence of incompetence. If I hadn't lived through the reality of their behavior, I might have found their version convincing. Then Jennifer stood to present our case. She methodically laid out the timeline of harassment, manipulation, and escalating control tactics. She presented Dr. Reese's evaluation, my employment records, character references from colleagues and friends. Your Honor, Jennifer said, what we have here is not a mentally incompetent woman who needs protection. We have a healthy adult who set reasonable boundaries with controlling parents, and those parents' extreme response to losing control over their daughter's life. Reese testified about her evaluation, explaining that I showed no signs of mental illness, manipulation, or poor judgment. My supervisor from the hospital testified about my professional competence and stable work performance. Marcus testified about our relationship, describing how I'd grown more confident and happy since we married, not less stable as my parents claimed. Then I testified on my own behalf. I spoke about the difference between loving family relationships and controlling one. I described the escalation of my parents' behavior and my decision to protect my marriage and mental health by setting boundaries. Your Honor, I said in conclusion, I don't need protection from my husband or my own decision. I need protection from parents who would rather destroy my life than accept that I have the right to live it on my own terms. The judge asked pointed questions of both sides, clearly trying to understand the true nature of the family dynamic. She seemed particularly interested in the private investigators and the workplace sabotage attempts. After 2 hours of testimony and arguments, Judge Morrison called for a recess to review the evidence. When court reconvened 30 minutes later, her decision was swift and decisive. After reviewing the extensive documentation presented by both parties, she said, I find no evidence that Mrs. Thompson is mentally incompetent or unable to make appropriate decisions about her life. The petitioner's concerns appear to stem from their disagreement with her choices, rather than any actual incapacity on her part. Relief flooded through me so intensely I thought I might cry. Furthermore, Judge Morrison continued, the court is troubled by the pattern of behavior documented by the respondent, the harassment, workplace interference and apparent surveillance, described in the testimony, suggest a concerning level of intrusion into an adult child's autonomous life. She looked directly at my parents. I am denying the conservatorship petition and ordering all parties to cease any further contact or interference with Mrs. Thompson, unless she initiates such contact herself. The gavel came down with a finality that felt like freedom. As we left the courthouse, I felt lighter than I had in months. My parents and Kyle walked past us without acknowledgement, their faces set in expressions of cold fury. I knew this wasn't over for them. People this invested in control don't usually accept defeat gracefully. But for me, it was over. I'd successfully defended my right to live my own life, to prioritize my marriage, and to set boundaries with family members who refused to respect them. 6 months later, Marcus and I were having dinner at our favorite restaurant when I noticed a young woman at a nearby table crying while talking on her phone. The conversation was one-sided, filled with apologies and promises to do better, the kind of desperate appeasement I recognized from my own past. When she hung up, I found myself walking over to her table. I'm sorry to intrude, I said gently, but I couldn't help overhear. Family can be complicated sometimes. She looked up with red-rimmed eyes. My mom wants me to move back home to take care of her, but she's not actually sick. She just doesn't want me living with my boyfriend. She says if I really loved her, I'd choose family over some guy. How long have you been with your boyfriend? 2 years. We're engaged, actually. But every time I try to plan the wedding, Mom finds some crisis that needs my attention. I sat down across from her, recognizing so much of my own story in hers. Can I tell you something? You don't owe your mother your entire life just because she gave birth to you. Healthy parents want their children to be independent and happy, even when that means they can't control every aspect of their life. We talked for 20 minutes, and I watched her face change as she began to see her situation from a different perspective. By the time I rejoined Marcus, she was sitting straighter, looking more determined than defeated. Another rescue mission? Marcus asked with a knowing smile. Maybe, or maybe just planting a seed. 3 weeks later, I received an email from her. She'd moved in with her fiancé permanently, and was planning a wedding her mother wasn't allowed to interfere with. She'd set boundaries and stuck to them, despite the guilt trips and manipulation that followed. That email reminded me why going public with our story had been the right choice, despite the personal cost. Sometimes people need to see that resistance is possible, that family relationships don't have to be built on control and guilt, and that choosing your own happiness isn't selfish, it's necessary. My parents and I haven't spoken since the court hearing. I occasionally hear updates through Aunt Patricia, who tells me they still believe they were trying to help me, and that I'll eventually come to my senses. Kyle sends a birthday card each year with no personal message, just his signature. The silence used to make me sad, but now it feels peaceful. I've built a life based on mutual respect, healthy boundaries, and genuine love rather than obligation and control. Marcus and I celebrated our first anniversary by returning to Mendocino, where we'd found peace during the crisis. Sometimes I think about what might have happened if I'd never set that first boundary about cleaning their house during my honeymoon. I probably would have spent my entire marriage mediating between my husband's needs and my parents' demands, never fully committing to either relationship. Instead, I learned that changing the locks wasn't just about keeping my parents out of my house, it was about keeping their dysfunction out of my marriage, their control out of my decisions, and their manipulation out of my head. The locks on our doors are still the same ones we installed that day, but more importantly, the boundaries I set in my heart have held strong. Sometimes the greatest act of love is refusing to enable someone else's dysfunction, even when that someone raised you, especially when that someone raised you. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.